am Saugata Sen, and with me is my colleague Dr. Nidhi Tewatia. We are from the School of Social Sciences, Faculty of Economics. We propose to discuss today the concept, a very important topic of economic growth and development. And so today, what we propose to do is to give you an idea of what growth is, what development is, the difference between the two, why it is important for countries to follow the paths of both, and towards the end, we'll have a brief discussion on what might be the factors that lead to growth and development. So without wasting any time, I would request Nidhi to take on the discussion and start explaining the important concepts of growth and development.
So as Sir has mentioned, we will be looking at growth and development. We will be looking at things which are very simple to understand, and as a layman also, one can understand about economic growth and development. So to start with, we'll be looking at some definitions. We will be looking at some measures of growth, traditional as well as new measures. We'll be looking at the indicators of growth. We will be looking at the features of development. We'll be also looking at the Millennium Development Goals, and finally we will conclude by Human Development Index and how it is measured. So first let us come at some definitions. The first definition is gross domestic product. It measures level of economic activity in an economy's boundaries in a particular time period, normally a year or a quarter. So the gross domestic product involves the market value of the total production in a country within 1 year. The other important definition in this subject of growth and development is income per capita. We are very fortunate to have such a measure which indicates that how on average an individual is faring in terms of money, in terms of the earnings. So this is calculated by total gross domestic product of a country divided by the total population. So it's a very simple formula. We simply divide the total production by total population. We receive the income per capita, or we can also call it average income of an individual in a nation. This is often used as an indicator of level of living and development. We will also understand how there are more things to cover under development as compared to only one measure, which is income per capita. It, however, can be a biased index because it takes no account of income distribution. So this concept does not talk about how the income is distributed, how much poverty exists in a nation, how many people own the maximum resources of a nation. It simply tells us an average income. The third one is economic growth. A simple definition is that it is an increase in the level of output of goods and services that is sustained over a long period of time, measured in terms of value added. Now we come on to the development. What exactly is development? We will also look at growth in a while. First, let us understand the larger domain of development. There are some traditional economic measures of development which we have been using throughout in our past history, and we have used them globally.
There are some measures of development, as Nidhi was talking about. Showing development of a country is to add to the basic measures of growth. Now, as we said, growth is measured by gross domestic product. Now, the basic measure of development traditionally has been to focus almost entirely on growth, and that is focus first on the per capita GDP or per capita GNP. We can come to that later. And there are methods which show how to calculate the level of distribution of the GDP among various sectors. For instance, it had been observed that traditionally societies which are developing or not so developed had a larger share of GDP and larger share of the population engaged in agriculture and primary activities. And as development took place, the manufacturing sector increased in importance. So that was one way of looking at development, whether in agriculture was paramount or predominant, or was it manufacturing. But as technology developed, in some countries, more than manufacturing, suddenly services sector took a leap. So what happens is that whenever you have a question of development, you look at the structural features of the economy and not merely the level of GDP. So what was emphasized from the very beginning is that GDP or growth is a necessary condition for development, but it's not a sufficient one. So once you have these conditions of GDP, and then you look at first the sectoral distribution of the income, then you also looked at the composition of income. Supposing a country is a very advanced country but spends a lot of its GDP on production, or much of its GDP comes from the production of, say, defense or armaments, then will you say it is a very developed nation? You may, if the level of GDP is very high, but supposing it's a lower level of GDP, but with a larger section of non-essential goods as in the basket of GDP goods, then the level of development is not there as much. Over time, people looked at not only factors different from growth, but also a little different from economic indicators only. For instance, people started looking at the measures of levels of literacy, the levels of health, the skewness of the income distribution. Is it very skewly? Do very few people have a lot of the wealth, or is the wealth more equitably distributed? What is the level of education? What is the enrollment ratio? So as these started changing over time, the way we looked at development and its indicators, that also started changing over time.
Sir mentioned that we have now come on to a new way of looking at development and growth. So when we look at the new way, we have actually included well-being as part of development of individuals as well as the country. That is why we hear a lot about the happiness index as well. And in the same line, we have another approach by Amartya Sen, which is capability approach. Now, this approach talks about capability deprivation due to certain economic lacking in certain families. For example, suppose we are looking at an individual who is a student and does not have enough money for the education. Now, that individual in the future is not going to receive a platform of opportunities as compared to those students who were able to study, who were having money so that they could study, and in the society they were further well included. Their opportunities, their benefits were far more than the individuals who were not able to study. So, the capability itself goes down in case we do not have economic well-being. So we move to the next slide now, and we talk about the economic growth and development. So there are clear differences between economic growth and development. The first one being that economic growth always talks about the total output growth. It does not talk about how it is distributed. So economic growth refers to increases over the time in country's real output, and output is generally measured by gross domestic product, which we initially discussed. The term economic development is actually far more comprehensive. It implies progressive changes in the socio-economic structure, where Sir also mentioned that we are looking at literacy, we are looking at happiness, we are looking at new measures of development. Economic growth is far easier to realize because it is simply about increasing the production of the country's goods and services as compared to economic development. This is because process of development is far more universal. It includes many more indicators and sectors as compared to economic growth. Apart from a rise in output, economic development involves changes in the composition of output, which Sir rightly mentioned, that we need to look at the sectoral shifts and the composition of the growth as well. The traditional measure, that is the average per capita income figures, do not really say anything about the distribution, which initially again we had mentioned. We move on to the next slide, which is about determinants of economic growth. Now, there are 4 of them. The 5th one is an additional new determinant. The traditional determinants have been human resource, which indicates that you need to increase and invest onto your human capital. If active population is increasing, you also need to, as a government, you also need to invest in human capital. Next is natural resources, which is including all kind of natural resources around us like land and other kind of resources which we use. Then the third is capital formation, that is we need to invest in capital, and the capital employed has a major role in the development of a country. And the fourth one is technology. Technology advancements, as we see, are happening very fast these days. The disruptions are around us in the present era of COVID. We all are able to use so many technological gadgets to our use, and hence in a country it matters how much of technological advancement we have. The 5th factor, which is a new additional factor, is the institutional reasons, the institutional factors like competitive markets, stable prices, the marginal taxes securing property rights, and the efficiency of economic organization. Now we move on to the advantages of economic growth. Economic growth gives us freedom because we earn more clearly, and it also helps us to be more humanitarian on humanitarian grounds. It helps us to pass on our additional resources to the people who are marginalized, people who are not having enough resources. Rapid economic growth is one of the important instruments to resolve social tensions as well. For examples, worker asking for higher wages, better housing, education, health, and other amenities. Economic growth helps women as well to gain freedom from drudgery, and they feel liberated and they are feeling more included in the process. Economic growth has been by far found the most effective tool to elevate poverty as well. Now we come on to the Millennium Development Goals. These goals were proposed and adopted by United Nations 2000, and these goals are looking at the concept of development. We have moved much ahead from looking at only growth. So the first one is eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, develop a global partnership for development. As this indicates that not only earning more, not only producing more, but a holistic kind of approach has been taken up by countries. These MDGs have further been supplemented by SDGs, where even the environment around us is a major factor. Now we look at the next slide, which is about Human Development Index. So we have understood about the economic growth, we have understood the indicators of economic growth, we have also understood what are the sources or indicators or determinants of economic growth. Then we have moved towards development, how far more comprehensive it is more universal in nature, and it is actually the need of the hour. We cannot only stick to the per capita income or how much we are earning as a measure of growth or development. Hence we come on to this index, which have been in use for many years now, and it has been updated as well. It is called Human Development Index. This index, as we see on the slide, this index talks about the emphasis which we need to give to the people and their capabilities, and that should be the ultimate criteria for assessing development, not economic growth. The Human Development Index is a summary measure of average achievements in key dimensions of human development. So there are 3 key dimensions of human development. The first one being a long and healthy life, the second being knowledgeable, and the third one is to have a decent standard of living. Now this Human Development Index is a geometric mean of normalized indices for each of these 3 dimensions. In the next slide, we are going to look at how these three indices are looked at or how they have been calculated. So all these three dissectional sectors, if you see, of HDI, long and healthy life, we look at the life expectancy at birth, and that life expectancy at birth for the population gets converted into life expectancy index. The second component was a decent standard of living. That decent standard of living straight away comes with gross national income per capita. Gross national income is the GDP, which we discussed in the beginning, plus the amount which we receive from overseas. That gross national income per capita gets converted into GNI index. So that's the second index. The third component about being knowledgeable, that is made up of further two components. The first one is expected years of schooling, and the second is mean years of schooling. Expected years of schooling meaning that how much is the expectation that our population would be having school for. The mean years of schooling is actually the average years of schooling an individual takes up, and that gives us the education index. So these are the three indices which we use to come on to HDI.
Nidhi gave a very comprehensive idea about the various ways development is conceived, conceptualized and measured, and how we can indicate or find out whether a nation is on its way to development, is on the path to development or not, and which nation is more developed than others. So that if we look at certain, let's say, which country has more successfully met the Millennium Development Goals, then we are looking at development. Then we also saw the capability approach of Amartya Sen being used, and it in a way culminated in the Human Development Index, which is a composite form of looking at growth combined with literacy, educational standards and basic health. Now, I will just add one or two things here. As Nidhi was saying, in modern times, a new dimension about health, about development that has been added is to look at cultural, institutional and government and the role of government and the cultural and institutional factors. The way we can look at it is to see countries which were at one point very similar in the levels of per capita income, very similar culturally, and see the path they took to development. Two examples can be taken: East and West Germany and North and South Korea. If we were to do that, then we find that the countries which relied excessively on central command economy, like East Germany and North Korea, from the middle of the 20th century till the end of the 20th century, really fell back, not only in levels of development, but also in the levels of growth itself. And the people there really had a lower standard of living as compared to their part of the country, which, or a country similar to theirs, which was once part of the same country. Say Germany was divided into East and West Germany. East Germany fell behind, and West Germany took advantage of market relations and global economic relations to develop. Same was the case with South Korea. Another example, of course, is China before and after liberalization. Before liberalization, when China embarked on the path of development in 1949, around the same time that India did, China and India were around the same level of per capita income and level of development. But since 1978, over the next 30 years or so, China displayed a level of development or a path or a speed that is almost unprecedented in human history. And it is now firmly a middle income nation, and it has transformed large sections of people's lives. Same with India. India, after liberalization in 1991, has been successful in bringing up a large proportion of people above the poverty line, whichever way you may measure the poverty index. But unfortunately, the income inequality has also gone up. So there are, as we were saying, there are various dimensions of development, which you need to study in totality. And some people have put in cultural factors, some people have put in the role of government, what particular policies government has done, and some like World Bank use the term good governance. It's a very oft used term these days, whether it is whether the governance is good and thereby promoting development or not. So development is a very fascinating subject. It's a multi-dimensional subject, and those of you who are enrolled in the program of CBCS BA Honours will get to study development economics in the courses BECC 112 and BECC 114, which is Economics of Development 1 and Economics of Development 2, respectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you.